Hello, everybody. Welcome to the presentation. Welcome to the webinar. I'd like to kick off with a question. And the question is very simply this. How would it feel if you could make nothing but better decisions in the future? Think for a second how that would make you feel. Well, how can we do that, you might ask? Well, it turns out there is a way, and it's by plugging into our shared human past, our shared collective history. Now, some people hear me say history and they say, oh God, no, Sean, not history. It's boring, it's irrelevant. It's just names and dates and all this kind of thing. It has no connection to our modern business life. Well, I sympathize with you. And in fact, so would Henry Ford, the famous car manufacturer. He once famously said that history is nothing but one damned thing after another. I guess that means it has nothing to teach us. But I would put to you that history is actually not that. History is actually, for us, a treasury, a repository of everything that's worked and everything that hasn't worked in our shared human past. So the question is, why would you not want to access that? Why would you not want to stand on the shoulders of these giants and look farther as a result of that? So what I'm going to do today is talk about goal setting, both private, personal goal setting, as well as business, corporate goal setting. And I'll give you a little insight into how we can do that. All right. Now, some people object or ask and say, well, don't we have already a lot of business theories already? We have a lot of leadership theories. We have a great deal of ways of handling this question already. Well, yes, that's true. Here's an example of a table of contents from one of the most popular books on the psychology of leadership. And if you look at this, you see all these available approaches. So we've got trait approach, which looks at leadership from the point of view of the characteristics that a leader might have, all the way down through path goal theory, authentic leadership, transformational leadership, and so on. And none of that's to take into consideration the various personality type tests that are administered, the fact that we have different plans in place which assign colors to different personalities, and you have to remember what color you are and match it to the person you're speaking with, and all of this together is supposed to make life much easier for you. It's not that these theories are bad, it's not that they're wrong, it's just that they're hard to remember when you need them. So when you're facing a problem, when you're facing a business situation or a personal situation, how are you supposed to remember all of these theories? The other problem I have with this is that from a practical point of view, is when you look at, for example, this table of contents, when you look at these 16 options that are available here, 15, 16 options that are available just in the textbook, there's usually just one or two that appeal to people by instinct. Everybody chooses different ones, and you choose the one that speaks to you the loudest. But that's sort of akin to having just a hammer in your toolkit. What happens is you start to see everything as a nail, and you start to frame everything in terms of how it would work with this particular approach. So I think that there's a little bit of a better way to do this. And it looks like this. I grew up sailing, and so I'm gravitating towards nautical charts. This is a sailing chart. And my position is that instead of memorizing sort of academic theories and putting up with being labeled or giving a color, having a color assigned to you or something like that, we can actually look at leadership as a chart. So you want to go from one island to the next. And if you look closely on this thing, you can see that they're very small and hard to pick out if you don't know what you're looking for, but you can see that there are navigational aids. So things to help you get from one place to another. Some of them warn of danger, some of them warn of safe areas, some of them acting as advice. You can use them as navigational aids insofar as telling how far off you are from something like this. The key thing about these aids is that they don't tell you what to do. They don't instruct you in what you ought to do. That's your job as the leader, is to decide the course. But these navigational aids are what are going to help you. And my way of using history in the past is to use various stories and various artifacts from our human past in order to act as these navigation aids to help you navigate the waters of leadership, so to speak. So you think, all right, how might this actually work in practice? How would historic objects, archaeological objects, stories from the past, how would that actually work? How do we translate that onto this kind of charts for you to navigate by? Well, let's take a look at this object here. Now, if you have your camera on me, you can see I'm holding it up in front of you now. This is an object from the 7th century BC. It's already about 2,700 years old. And I'll throw it open to the audience for questions. What is it, actually? All right, I see some answers coming in. Yes, A horse, that is in fact what it is. This is an archaic horse. This is something that the ancients knew as a votive offering. A votive offering is something that you gave to a temple, for example, to either ask for something or to express your thanks for something. But what's interesting for us here is not what this was used for in antiquity. What's interesting for us here as leaders who are going to be setting goals is this. 2,500 years ago, more than that, somebody who is now long dead and gone, whose brain has turned to dust, has formulated an idea of horseness, right? And the person, and it was almost certainly a man, made this object, and now across cultures, across time, across languages, and across religions, this idea of horseness, this artist's conception of what it means to be a horse, has gone from his brain and has now traveled across time and gone into your mind. In other words, when you look at this and you identify it as a horse, you are actually communicating with the past. Now, it seems pretty simple at this point. So, okay, somebody who's long dead said this is a horse and made a depiction of a horse. But actually, if you look at it, it's interesting because it is a horse, but it doesn't necessarily look like any one particular horse, does it? The body is far too thin. The head is far too long. It's not a realistic depiction of any one particular given horse, right? What the artist was trying to do was talk about the essence of horseness. So the big head would indicate what intelligence, the ears sticking up would indicate attentiveness. The unnaturally small chest would indicate agility and ability to move quickly. So now the person in the past is no longer saying just simply this is a horse, but they're actually giving you clues as to what they think about it. That the animal is agile, it's smart, it's receptive, and not something else. So we're talking about more of an abstract conception here. And now you're really engaged in the art of talking to the past. And that's what you can do for a lot more stories as well, including how to set goals. Now, today we're going to be talking about goal setting, and we're going to be talking about different levels of goal setting. So there's one level of goal setting that we're all very familiar with. We'll talk about that in a bit. But I'd like to use an ancient story to illustrate one of the dangers of setting goals. One of the perils, one of the things that we don't usually talk about when we set goals. And the best way to do that is to take a look at what the ancient Greeks had to say. And if we go back to the time of the Trojan War, so we're looking at, about 3,000 years ago, and now a little bit over 3,000 years ago. The story opens with Agamemnon, who was the king of Mycenae, one of the Greek states, before 700 years before the classical period. And old Agamemnon had a brother called Menelaus. And Menelaus had a wife called Helen. And some say willingly and some say unwillingly, one of the princes of the fabled city of Troy visited Sparta, and Helen was taken by him, Paris, and he or she joined him willingly, depending on what source you want to believe. And they went off to Troy. Now, this was an insult to the ruling house in Greece, and this had to be avenged. But it was also an opportunity for Agamemnon, as the leader of all of these collections of city-states, to enrich themselves. In short, it was basically an enormous business opportunity. You go over there, you sack the city of Troy, gain untold riches and fame, and come back again, and having avenged yourself. Now, that plan seemed all very well. Agamemnon called together all the ships that he could from all the kings and princes around, forming his community, and they gathered in the end over 1,000 ships. So Helen, of course, was known as the face that launched 1,000 ships, and turned out to be there were more than that. And they gathered at this place here. This is a place that I visited just this past summer. This is the little port of Aulis in Greece. That's the island of Euboea, as it was pronounced in antiquity, behind. So all of these ships gathered here, met here, and you can imagine the hills where this photograph was taken, just teeming with the ancient Greek warriors ready to sail across the sea and take Troy. The problem was that the wind died and then started to blow against them. And it blew against them and against them and against them, and it was unrelenting. And the problem was the Greek warriors based here were starting to run out of food and provisions. They certainly weren't going to Troy to get rich, that's for sure. So what to do? Well, it turns out Agamemnon consulted a soothsayer, and he found out that, in fact, he had offended one of the goddesses, Artemis, I think. And the only way to appease the goddess, to apologize for whatever transgression he'd committed, was to sacrifice his daughter. His daughter was called Iphigenia. So Agamemnon, who loved his daughter very much, said, well, I guess we'll have to go sack Troy next year. We're not going to do it this year. Let's get ready to go home. Now, no sooner had he thought this when Odysseus, another one of the kings, came up to him and had a word with him in his ear. When Agamemnon paused, he said, okay. And he sent a messenger to his wife, Clytemnestra, back in Mycenae. He said, I found a husband, Achilles, for our daughter Iphigenia. Send her to me here at Aulis, and she will be married. So this messenger arrived, and the message was received, and of course Iphigenia was thrilled by this. I mean, who wouldn't be to marry the greatest warrior of the age? Agamemnon's wife, Clytemnestra, got her all ready, sent her off, and she arrives here in this place, and she's led to what she thinks is going to be the bridal altar. But it turns out it is in fact a sacrificial altar. And she cries and protests, but Agamemnon uses a weapon very much like this one and cuts her throat. Now, this object here is a copy of a Bronze Age sword. This is very much like the one Agamemnon would have had. And if you look closely on there, you can see it's inlaid there with a depiction of a lion hunt. And the person who held this, a prince or a king, was holding it because he had the courage of a lion. He was able to stand in battle against wild animals. And you can imagine what he must be thinking as he's looking into the eyes of his beloved daughter, as he's cutting her throat open with this sword. He's supposed to be this mighty warrior, and instead he's making this ultimate sacrifice. Now, the thing about this is that Agamemnon got what he wanted. The sacrifice was accepted, and he sailed away to Troy, and they were victorious. It took 10 years, far longer than expected. In fact, it didn't take 10 years. That was impossible for a Bronze Age army. But the point is, it took a long time, and it was much more difficult than they set out. But the key point for us is that Agamemnon achieved his goal. He got what he wanted. He rescued his brother's wife, he sacked the city, and he sailed home successfully, and he was richer than the dreams of avarice. He was famed throughout his world for this. He had achieved his goal. He was rich and he was famous, and he was coming home. And he got home, and his wife, Clytemnestra, prepared a great feast for him, and he had the greatest feast of his life. And then he retired to the bathroom and had a bath. And he was sitting in his bath when his wife came in, took the sword, and then butchered her husband in retaliation for this. Now, for a Bronze Age warrior, you can imagine being killed wasn't the greatest thing in the world, but to be killed by a woman was almost unimaginable. To be killed by your wife was even more unimaginable. To be killed with your own sword in your own bath while naked was the most absurd ending imaginable. So the question now we have to ask ourselves is very simple. Agamemnon achieved his goals. He achieved what he wanted to achieve, but at what cost? Did he sacrifice too much, actually? Did he actually come back and enjoy the fruits of his victory, or did he overreach himself? And this is the question we're going to be talking about a little bit more today. So that's the first thing to keep in mind, is be careful of what goals you set and ask yourself, what are you willing to sacrifice in order to get those goals? So you will be successful, or we hope you'll be successful, but how far are you willing to go? How much of a sacrifice are you willing to make to reach the goal? And that's what we never talk about. And that's what really ought to change. Now, there is a second side. There's two sides to this blade, and there's two sides to the story. If we go back to Odysseus having a word in Agamemnon's ear, what he said was something very interesting. He said, look, if you disband the fleet now and send everybody home, you will have shown your crew and shown your team that you are asking them to make sacrifices, but you're unwilling to make sacrifices yourself. So they've left their homes. Yes, of course, they're going for what we would call today a business opportunity, a chance to get rich and famous. But Agamemnon asked them to leave their homes, leave their families, endanger their own lives, put their own lives at risk, their own time and money at risk to achieve this goal of his. And if he just simply calls off the whole thing when he's asked to make a sacrifice, what kind of a leader is he? Probably a pretty bad one. And so Agamemnon understood this and realized he had basically boxed himself into a corner and had to sacrifice his daughter. So I guess the moral of this particular point of the story is when you formulate your goals and when you're creating your goals, not only do you have to ask yourself and to specifically formulate exactly what it is that you're willing to sacrifice, but then you also as the leader have to be willing to be the first one to make that sacrifice. You can't ask your team to sacrifice things that you're not willing to sacrifice yourself. And that's an interesting twist to this story because his team stuck with him for that 10 years. And again, that's just a synonym, sort of a metaphor for a very long time. But he actually got what he wanted with that. So that brings us back to the beginning. So what can we take away from this in terms of our modern business sensibilities. Well, we hinted at it pretty strongly already, but if we go back to this, I'm sure many of you have seen this, SMART goals. They have to be specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, time-bound. So far so good, but I would like to say that this is like a level 1 goal setting technique. So yes, you're asking, if you go back to the chart, for example, and sailing from one shore to the other. Yes, your goal is specific. Yes, you can measure it. It's a certain number of miles away. It's attainable. We have enough food for on the boat to get there. It's relevant. We want to sail to the island. It's time bound. We're going to do it in a certain number of hours, for example. But again, the real question to ask ourselves is, what is it worth to us? Now, when we talk about these level 1 goal making sort of techniques, we have this here, but we also have some other ones. You often hear, I've made a list here of some things that people have told me over the years. Some of the goal setting benchmarks are be realistic, so that's implied in this model. You should set measurable targets. Of course, that's also a part of it. Consider time frames, emphasize learning, seek feedback, and so on. But I think what the Iphigenia story is asking us to consider is not just be aware of the consequences of your goal setting, not just to be aware of what you're willing to sacrifice in order to get your goal, but also to be very concrete about what you're willing to sacrifice. So what else can we sacrifice? What else ought we to take in mind? Sort of a level 2 level of setting goals. Well, I would suggest that we take into consideration ethical values. So upholding ethical values is crucial to good leadership. You could question whether Agamemnon was guilty of that. I would say he probably was. Personal well-being. I think we've seen time and time again how people in the modern world end up accidentally, rather like Agamemnon, sacrificing the things that are most valuable to us. Our time with our families, our free time, our mental health in order to achieve business goals or private goals or some combination of them. Relationships, work-life balance, things of this nature. These are all goals that we have to take in mind and that the Iphigenia story is suggesting that we do. There's also the question of legal boundaries, a sense of self, joy in the moment. These are all the sort of the higher level things. So that's what I would like to sort of wrap up here and to say, when we go back to this chart, we could take the sword that I just showed you and let the sword stand for one of these navigational buoys on this chart. So the sword isn't going to tell you what to do when you set your goals. It's not going to suggest anything concrete. The sword is just reminding us of this story and reminding us of the value of being aware of the deeper things that we're possibly be called on to sacrifice. And so I'll wrap up by saying that what matters ultimately is not what I say to you today. What matters is what you do with what I say today. So one of the things you can do is to take an artifact. You could, in fact, take a screenshot of this sword, or you could buy a copy online. They sell them in souvenir shops. It just serves to remind you of the story. That's what I do. I mean, I pointed out this horse here that I have. I keep this on my shelf to remind me of these things. And the point is this: if you have an artifact that's relevant to you, it could be that sword, it could be some other artifact that's relevant in your own life. And when it comes time to set goals for your department, for your company, and for yourself, if you have that object somewhere in your line of sight, it's going to trigger the memory of what I've said today, I hope. And not only will you talk about the smartness, so to speak, of the goals that you're setting, but also you will take some time to spell out in concrete details what you're willing to sacrifice, how much is too far, where are you not going to go to achieve this goal, and to make them accordingly. All right, so I would invite you at the end to choose your artifact. Find something in your own life that gives this basic message. You can use the sword if you want, or your own thing, and have it close at hand. If it's too big, take a photograph of it and have it on your phone. And when it comes time to set goals, have it there just to remind yourself of what we talked about today. And other than that, I think this is a good place to wrap it up and to say happy goal setting, everybody, and all the best. I'll open it up now for questions if anybody would like to write or ask a question. So we have a question here. What if my level of sacrifice is unacceptable for other people in my team? So in other words, we have this situation where sometimes you're highly motivated, if I understand correctly. You're highly motivated, but the rest of the team isn't highly motivated. How do you do that? That would probably come in, funnily enough, I'll go back to the models that we started off with. That would be a case of looking at how transformative your leadership is. So you could make the sacrifice but that doesn't mean that everybody else is necessarily ready to do so. So if you find yourself in a situation where you're able to make the sacrifice and that's enough, okay. If they're not able to make the sacrifice or unwilling to make the sacrifice, then you have to take that into consideration while you're setting the goals. So don't set goals that your team is unable to fulfill, right? Or if you would like them to move in that direction, do so by inspiring them to get behind your mission. Now, hopefully that won't mean making the sacrifice that Agamemnon did, but we have to probably at that point go beyond just a transactional style of leadership and into a transformative, inspirational style of leadership so that they get behind the mission. Yeah, that's a good question. No, I definitely, and this is why I think it's necessary and useful to talk about goals and not just assume that everybody knows what it means. It's useful to have this discussion where we take the sort of Agamemnon, the ancient Greek approach, and actually question what it is that we were trying to do and why and how much we're willing to sacrifice. And what if everybody's not willing to sacrifice? What do we do then? More inspirational leadership, change the goals, some combination thereof. It's up to each individual person to describe. That's another thing as well. When you talk about leadership, you look at examples of historical leadership and how leadership has evolved over the centuries and millennia. One thing that comes into mind is the fact that leadership is very contextualized. It's very based on the situation and on the context. So if you have somebody who tells you, all right, we have a certain model of leadership, this is what you must do, you must never do anything else, that's probably not going to work very often. What I was alluding to before when we talked about the hammer, just everything becomes a nail. So leadership is very contextualized, it's very context-based. What worked once doesn't necessarily work again, and so on. Good. Does that answer that question reasonably well? Yes, very good. Does anybody else have anything else they would like to talk about? Right, what is the best way to communicate to others your goals? So there are a lot of different theories about this. What Agamemnon did was just spell it out for them and get their backing. So it was appeal to self-interest, it was appeal to justice, it was appeal to these nobler causes. And I think they were inspired by the sacrifice he made. I mean, bear in mind, this is a warrior culture from the Bronze Age, so what inspired them isn't going to necessarily inspire us. But yeah, definitely bring them into the process. Don't be shy about what you're trying to do. I think a lot of leaders they try and manipulate the situation to produce a certain effect, rather than just simply coming clean, so to speak, and saying, hey, look, here's what we're trying to do. Here is how to do that. I'd like to involve you not just in the discussion of how we're going to reach that goal, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on what we're willing to sacrifice to get to that goal. Now, imagine how empowering that is if you say to your team at the outset, now, for example, in the new year, but anytime you set goals and you say to your team, look, here's what we're going to do. This is the direction we want to go in. But how much are you willing to sacrifice? Here's how much I'm willing to sacrifice. We need to have a discussion around how far we can go in this. Now, sometimes, I mean, you don't want to take this overboard. You don't need to do this for necessarily every objective. The big objectives that you're setting, it's absolutely worth involving them in the discussion bluntly, so to speak, and just telling them directly, let's have your thoughts on it and see. That would, first of all, apart from anything else, that'll give you a pretty good idea on where they stand on this. So good. Does that handle that reasonably well? Yes, good. Anything else from anybody else? No? All right. Thank you all for your time. And as I said before, happy goal setting. Thanks, everybody.